The time has come to tell the truth.
I'll wake up and smell the coffee.
Today is the beginning of a new chapter.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by two great writers, two, in my opinion, of the greatest comedy writers of their generation, Laurence Marks and Maurice Gran. Welcome to the podcast, both of you.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Well, it's lovely to have you on. The first question I'd like to ask is, how did you first begin working together as writers?
Well, Laurence and I knew each other since we were kids, and then in our early 20s, we joined a writing group. Laurence was a journalist at the time, and I was a civil servant, but I did a bit of writing on the side. We joined a script writing group just to go along, really, to see people's work being performed. And then we started writing bits and pieces separately. And then at the suggestion of the guy who ran the place, he said, why don't you try writing together, which we hadn't considered, strangely. And once we started doing that and started sending things off and getting encouraging rejection is how we always describe it, you're sort of seen as a partnership, and comedy writing partnerships were very much the thing back then, maybe not so much now. So that's really a potted version of how we got going, and we're talking sort of 45 years ago, believe it or not, maybe more.
Much more.
Well,
40 years ago.
I'm counting from when we actually started making a living.
Well,
but
we started that was different.
50 years since we sent probably our first thing off, maybe more. It doesn't bear thinking about, it truly doesn't. So I won't.
And would you say that your aim had always been to write comedy that had sort of a political or social element to it? Because I think even sort of like the series that obviously like Birds of a Feather has perhaps more of a kind of like a social element than maybe necessarily a political element to it. But was that something that always kind of interested you, having a sort of an underlying message in your comedy?
Some shows we did and others we didn't. I mean, the first thing is to just get your foot in the door. Although the show that got our foot in the door had a social element. It looked at a man staying at home and bringing up a child, and a woman going back to work having produced the child. I don't know whether that was conscious, but I do think that by the time we were writing Harvey Moon, we were much more aware of the political aspect that would filter into our work.
But you don't sit around looking for a political subject. You don't. I didn't come to her and say, you know what, we've got a great comedy about the going on in socialist society, University College. They were a bundle of laughs.
But when we thought of Harvey Moon, because we wanted to write something about the immediate post-Second World War era, it was obvious that we were going to take a stand as to why life, well, in fact, I remember why life then was much harder than the life of the complaining public in 1981 and 2, where they were saying that life has never been tougher. And we're saying, yes, it has been. And this is when it was tougher, and looked at that period of time. Holding the fort wasn't political in the slightest, but it was a social reflection.
Well, if you're socially aware, it reflects in your work. So you don't have a question of, obviously what I'd really like to have written is Mrs. Brown's Boys, because that's a masterpiece, but it never occurred to me. I berate myself daily. So you're drawn to the things that you're drawn to, and then you write them. And then I wrote a piece last week about a play we've written, in which I said we're instinctive or instinctual writers. Afterwards, you might say, that's interesting. I wonder. Or someone might say, oh, obviously you wrote this because, and you say, no, we didn't obviously write this because. It just comes out. If you write from any sort of honesty, then your personality will come out. And luckily, um, Laurence and I have, broadly similar views.
Mm,
Although on the other hand, I don't know if you've ever spoken to, for example, Jonathan Lynn, who co-created Yes Minister.
mm,
But I think that Jonathan and who was his co
Anthony J.
Anthony J
mm,
came from very different
mm.
political points of view, and their work came out of civilized disagreement.
Mm.
So there's all different ways of doing it. It's just we were interested.
I think at the time we were writing these pieces,
Yeah.
we were not analysing them as happens now. So people look back and say,
Yeah.
you must have meant to.
Yeah.
And the answer is, I don't know what we meant to. I think what we meant to was write a hit show.
Yes.
That's what we meant to.
Or even a show.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned Harvey Moon there, and I would like to start off by talking about Harvey Moon. It's a fantastic show that I think more people should certainly watch. And the central political element is obviously within the main character of Harvey himself coming back from serving in the forces, being a clerk in India, and returning to London and becoming involved in Labour politics, being
Yeah.
elected as a local councillor. Was that something that you felt it was important, that not just in kind of like displaying the sort of like the differences between the early 80s and the post-war period in terms of how life was, but did you also think it was important that Harvey himself had an interest in politics and that he was a kind of like a sort of like a political animal, albeit one that develops his political ideas throughout the series?
Well,
Right.
I think if you're going to write something about a returning soldier, uh, and 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 the idea was inspired by a famous magazine cover that Laurence saw, a soldier running up to um, his family who hadn't seen him for 5 years, and Laurence said, "But suppose she's thinking, oh fuck, he survived,"
Mm.
um, and
But then the show was about a broken
yeah,
marriage, about trying to put your life back together.
it was about all those things.
It
And
wasn't until, if I recall correctly, series 2, when the girlfriend, who he lost, in fact, at
Yeah,
series 3, introduced him to Labour
well, that was
politics.
yes, but again, we're talking about it as if it just happened rather than we actually decided to do it. But Lawrence is right. But to go back to the beginning of it, when he came back, the basic premise was he'd lost everything. Can you
yeah.
write a comedy about a man who'd lost everything? His family, his wife, his house, his job, because he was a
Hmm.
footballer.
Yeah.
And what was he going to do? Um, and I think that the choices, were fairly minimal for
Mm.
us. Thinking about it, he could either have been someone who reflected the spirit of the age, or he could have been someone who um, rebelled against the spirit of the age and came back and I want to be a small businessman and make my own way in the world without all this nanny state.
Mm.
That, but that's not something we would have written, with sincerity. So pretty quickly, the die was cast, and it suited us um, to go that way. I mean, I must slightly modify what Laurence said, in as much as, although we were writing about the immediate post-war period as a period where times were tougher than people in the 80s might have realized, we also wanted to write about them as time as a period of hope.
Mm.
There had been victory, there was hope. It was a new world. A lot of that hope has now been undermined or historically revised by
Mm.
some quarters. What a terrible pity it was we had a health service when that money could all have been put into rebuilding industry. Is a point of view that one reads. But as Laurence said, with series 2, and this is a long time ago, but we started off writing a series of half hours,
Mhm.
The people at Central Television, it might have still been ATV at the time, not that it matters, they liked it so much that even before it was transmitted, they said, "Oh, we actually think the next season you should turn it into a comedy drama
Mm.
and make them hour-long episodes." There was obviously some infighting going on at ATV between the comedy department and the drama department, from which we benefited. So then we had never written hour-long comedy drama, and in fact, very few had. We virtually, I wouldn't say we invented it, but between us and possibly Minder, that was about what there was. So we had to find a way, a shortcut to how to do it because we were flying blind. So literally on a sheet of paper, we wrote down health, education, housing. I can't think what else, religion maybe, but the big topics
Mm.
that you could, here's a posh word coming, interrogate the era. Uh, and so, and because we're running about the 40s, all the big topics of the 40s
Mm.
were political.
Mm.
Um, and then once we had that, we had a sort of structure. And as Laurence said, through when he got Stanley into the grammar
Mhm.
school,
Yeah.
uh, was surprised that Stanley's extremely posh Kensington-based school teacher was a member of the Hackney Labour Party,
Yeah.
and so that brought Harvey into politics.
And on those sort of like those subjects, that's something I think that is really reinforced, as you say, throughout the series with the Harvey's desire for Stanley not to just get to the grammar school but go to university. The housing element when I think it's the end of the third season when the block of flats that Violet lives in with Harvey is about to be pulled down, and she gets the committee around to try and stop the flats being knocked down, even though there's an unexploded bomb
Yes, yes,
underneath them. The prefab, of course, being continually sort of like filled with mold and rot.
yes, yes.
There's this real mixture, isn't there, between kind of like despair at some of the issues that there are with the system as it is, but also that hope as well for change within the system. Do you think that that was something sort of like kind of like inverse of what was happening in the 1980s, where there were similar feelings of despair, but quite often, particularly for people who were sort of like more on the left in the Labour Party, there wasn't much hope of things getting better, at least electorally.
I think you can't remove the period in which we were writing it from the period we were writing about.
Hmm.
The 80s were desperate in many ways. In fact, I think this one of the starting points of our thinking, and Maurice will remember this, was when people were complaining that they didn't have room for their two cars,
Mm.
or that their microwave oven had broken down, and what do they do? Like all the luxuries we had then, people were complaining about. But it was a dreadful time because we'd been through the second half of the 70s, which was about as bad as it got, and into Thatcherism in the early 80s, which offered no hope, it seemed. And then we were going to go to war. That was the situation we were writing through. About a period, as Maurice said, when there was hope, life had to be better than what we've known. And Harvey was always full of hope. He was hoping he could bring his family back together again, even though Nan, or Violet, said, "You're better off without her." Hope that Stanley would have a much better life than he had, that grammar school would be the route to stability, that his daughter would marry the right person. And when she met someone who wasn't Lou Lewis, that looked like he had a future, that was and that, of course, for Harvey to meet a woman completely outside of his class who believed in things. That didn't mean Rita was a bad mother. It meant that Harvey was moving forward. He was seeing the world opening beyond Hackney, and when persuaded. In fact, I remember a speech from Harriet, the teacher, who said, "You don't think enough of yourself, Harvey. You should stand for councillor of this particular ward. You can do it." He needed someone to promote him, and there were many. And then, of course, having pushed himself forward in that respect, he then finds himself, and this was much more in series 3, the opportunity to have a white collar job, which was something that had never existed in his life.
It was so, we're reflecting the time as we remembered it, and of course, although we were born at the end of the 40s, and grew up, our infancy in the 50s, it was still, it was still not so different to the period we were writing about. We still had gas lights in the street when I was 7 or 8 years old, and a guy would come and turn them on and turn them off with a long stick. Sort of what were called pig bins, where you put your waste food out in the street and they were carted off.
Horse trough on the
So we were sort of able to write to a certain degree from knowledge. But I would say, I mean, we're going off the point, of course, because that's what we do. But in terms of the politics that we were engaging with, and again, I think we were pretty much in line. People who you might broadly call mainstream Labour were pretty despondent by 79. The government was the very, very fag end of the Attlee promise. And Callaghan still seemed to think it was 1950. And he could, through things like doing deals in smoke-filled sandwiches with his mates from the TUC, one of whom turned out to be a long-standing KGB sleeper, were going to somehow do a deal that there wouldn't be bodies lying in the street, and so on and so forth. And of course, to say that the Tories were offered an open net to shoot into in 79 is an understatement. And then the immediate reaction of the left was to split and to guarantee 15 years of Conservative rule. So, as observers rather than participants in politics, I speak for myself, I don't know if others can don't think we'll disagree that much. We were looking at it and saying, well, this is really, this is a mess. It's no way to run a tea party. But ironically, most of our success during the 80s and certainly the 90s was due to Margaret Thatcher taking up the monopoly of terrestrial television and opening out to independent production. And that apparently happened the day that ITN sent 8 people to Downing Street to record a 5-minute clip. And she wondered at that somewhat. So it's complicated because we obviously didn't care for what the Tories set out to do to this country, but we were not. I wasn't amazed that they were repeatedly elected to do it.
But when you think about why they were competing, I mean, Labour Party, I was on strike 3 times in 79. That's how bad things were. And we were all Labour supporters, and yet we were pulled out by another union to support them. We were then pulled out by our own union. And then on Maurice and my first day in television, the night we were going to record our very first comedy, the ACTT called a strike and we were pulled out then. So 3 times in that year I was on strike.
We weren't on strike, we were stricken.
Then Thatcher gets in and everyone says, well, thank God for that. Look at the mess Labour. And I think, to be honest with you, and since learned that from Tony Benn, that Labour were rather pleased they lost the election because things were just so bad they couldn't see a way out of them. Thatcher, it fell to Thatcher to try and find a way out.
Rather like,
but in 1983, when Thatcher was going to fight an election against Michael Foot, of all people. I was a member of the Labour Party, and I thought it was ridiculous that this man should attempt to win an election against anyone, let alone against this woman. And it wasn't until Kinnock came in, but that was really after Harvey's first two series, that you thought there was any hope for Labour.
But I think, anyway, there's a long answer to
All I'm saying is, what we were looking at was how well Attlee managed the Labour Party. And I think Harvey Moon looked up to Attlee and saw that if this man can do it, then I can do it. The third series was much more interesting. I'm actually happen to be watching it at the moment because it was on a channel that I just set to record. Because when, as you so rightly point out, Nan has to be rehoused. But there is no housing, much like now.
I think they're blown up at the end of series 2.
So yes, and so in the first of series 3, Harvey, as a councillor, finds a home for himself and not constituent. That house is in a house owned by a Viennese refugees, and that opens a whole other new world to Harvey.
But of course, Harvey is faced with the sort of problem that has just seen the fourth Labour minister have to resign. Which is that suddenly it's all very well to have high principles, but when you're a councillor and your mum's been bombed out, you jump the housing list. And of course, but we've never been starry-eyed about how things really are. And it doesn't make Harvey a bad person, but it makes him a very flawed person.
And on the series with the Gottliebs, I think it was particularly interesting the episode that you wrote about when the young refugee from the Holocaust manages to arrive there at the Gottlieb's house because he's sort of like the only real relation that they've got. And I think that you particularly dealt with well the kind of psychological effects that come with having survived the Holocaust at that time and being unable to sort of to deal with suddenly being in an entirely different situation, being in London and not really knowing anyone or sort of like knowing kind of like the language.
And is that the episode where the synagogue gets burned down?
No, that was an early.
The
reason the synagogue got burnt down was because of what was going on in Israel or Palestine. And revenge was taken on the Jews of North London by burning the synagogue down. She saw that as a complete replica of what was happening in Vienna.
Which we didn't intend to be prescient, but there you go. Can't help it sometimes.
I just wondered with the particular episode with the young refugee, whether that was sort of like something that it was sort of like you felt it was important to show the kind of like the sort of like the emotional and psychological strain and the difficulty with say people like Harvey and Nan being able to understand what he had gone through and kind of like just sort of like finding it difficult to kind of to fully relate and to understand his situation. Do you think it was important to show that within the context of the series?
Because who could understand what these people went?
Well, I don't think I can't say when we were working out the stories of series 3, which I think we wrote all of. We didn't write all. We didn't write all of series 4.
No.
That why that particular story at that particular time, but we were always looking at the timeline. You see, one of the things we try to do in anything we write is to write something which has got a timeline, whether it's a prison sentence in Birds of a Feather or whether it's just the march of history in Harvey Moon, so that you're saying, well, it's now 1947, what's going on? It's 1946, what's going on? And just from that you can pluck some fantastic stories. And whether we read, and we might well have read, that there was an influx of refugee children coming into the country in January 1947, but also the Gottliebs who...
Yes, that was the thing. It was the Gottliebs who had even in episode 1, Frida had spoken about her brother who was a doctor,
yes.
was a doctor,
Yeah.
was a doctor.
And so that enabled us to deal with something,
It was important, that episode, because we felt you couldn't go through the 40s in a Viennese Jewish household without there being a survivor.
And
of course there were, but not, I mean, there were those that settled here or were placed here after what we wanted, because everything was intermeshed. You see, at that time, Maggie Moon had started going out with a man in shipping. And so we worked out that perhaps if this boy didn't belong here, he could get out via this man. So you're introducing all your characters and making them work for the story. And in fact, that was a very important episode in my life in many ways, because it set it on another course. It started replicating Harvey's life in a strange sort of way. But no, I think that it was very important. And I remember that when Maurice and I wrote that episode, what was so difficult was that I won't call him the central character, but the central character of that story didn't speak. He was too traumatized to speak. And it was a challenge to write an episode where a central character is too traumatized to talk, and everyone has their own reflection on this young boy. Look what he's been through, Rabbi. He won't do this. He won't eat that. He gets up in the night. He screams in the night. Everyone reflected their thoughts about Auschwitz on Yossela. And we could only imagine what it was like. I mean, I hadn't visited Auschwitz at that time, so I didn't even geographically know what it looked like. And so that was a challenging episode to write, but a very fulfilling one.
Yeah, and a very powerful one, as I say. I think one that really, anyone who's seen it, I'm sure it will stay with them. Yeah, it's a sort of like a
I don't think we could have written an episode like that had it been a half-hour series.
Yeah, I think it would have been impossible simply because of the sort of the content needs that kind of really
and
needs
there were
that.
other such content. As Maurice mentioned, the synagogue being burnt down because of what was going on in Palestine by British soldiers. There was the inevitable winter episode, the worst winter of the century, when nobody had anything at all. And we thought, if ever there was an illustration of why you shouldn't complain in 1984, take a look at that episode.
Yeah. And it was a little bit after, obviously, 1984 going into 1987 that you started writing The New Statesman. And I'd like to move on to discussing that series now. What was the sort of like the genesis of the idea behind The New Statesman? How did you come up with the idea for it?
Well, segueing perfectly into it, the gentleman that came up to us was a devotee of Shine on Harvey Moon. And he said, "Are you the guys that write Harvey Moon?" He said, "Yeah." And it wasn't quite as straightforward as this. He said, "Write me a series," and that was Rick Mail.
Yeah. We met Rick at a comedy conference, and he asked us, simplifying things, we'd write him a show. Our initial reaction was no, and didn't say no to him. But afterwards, we said, well, we don't want to work with him because he's in the young ones. Nigel's in the young ones. We've done 2 shows with Nigel. We love Nigel, but he's a bit balmy. Judging by the young ones, Rick is even balmier. Most unfair on both Rick and Nigel. Anyway, eventually our paths crossed again. Ironically, the reason we met Rick was because we'd been working in the States, and on our return, were invited to address this comedy conference. Because of our time in the States, we were then invited onto the Wogan show, and Rick was on the Wogan show, and he said, "Why didn't you call me, you bastards?" And so we eventually got together with him, and we said, "Okay, if we were to do."
Well, I think we should, if I may interrupt, what was the biggest surprise? We arranged a venue and said to Rick, "Okay, we'll have lunch with you. Let's meet at this venue in a London hotel." and he turned up in a suit. I mean, he turned up not as Rick as anyone knew him or anyone had seen him, but a hugely handsome, respectable, almost businessman. He could have actually just been taking a lunch break from his job in the city. And that was so untypical of Rick. So he must have imagined that this meeting was going to be important. And it also directed us towards what we eventually spoke
to a
about.
degree. We said, oh, one of us said, what sort of character do you want to play? And he said, I want to play, you may have heard this anecdote, someone who represents all my worst personal traits. I want to play someone who's greedy and depraved and cowardly and sex mad and cruel and murderous. So I said, oh, you want to play a Tory MP? And he loved that idea. And this was now 66, 86, 87. Oh,
80, the election was in 87, so it was 87.
Yeah.
No, that was 86.
We had this notion, and we sold it to Yorkshire Television because the man who was head of comedy there, a man called Laurence, who we'd also met at that ITV symposium, we knew he was a big fan of Rick. He actually said he was. He'd seen him in the theatre. And he found us a studio, although he said initially said he didn't have any, but then he found us a studio. And the New Statesman, Alan Bastard was born. We wanted to call him Alan Bastard to start with, and we wanted to call the show The Bastard File.
And ITV wouldn't allow
it. And so we changed the Bastard, which actually was better. And
then tell them the really good story. We didn't know what we were going to call it.
I wasn't there, so you can tell that story.
Well, we were in the rehearsal room, and we wanted it to be The Bastard File. We'd heard from David Reynolds, our producer, that ITV won't entertain the word bastard in any show. So Maurice and I thought of three possible titles. One was The New Statesman. One was The Bastard File, I think, with a B apostrophe S.
Yeah.
The third was Maggie's Wet Member, which Rick liked, of course.
Because Rick would like it because he didn't understand politics. And I kept saying, no, it's got to be Maggie's Dry Member. But
anyway, we put these three names in a hat and walked out along Goldhawk Road, and a woman was walking toward us with a pram, and I stopped her and said, excuse me, can I bother you?
Accosted her.
And would you mind choosing the name of a new series? And the three names are in this bag, and she put her hand in and pulled out The New Statesman, and that's why it was called.
And the most extraordinary thing, looking back, was that no one seemed to remember, not only us, but not anyone at Yorkshire Television either, that there had been a short-lived, not particularly successful series called The New Statesman.
Oh, wow.
About a councillor.
Tim West.
Was it Tim West? Which I think might have gone out in the time that we weren't in the country, which no one seemed to even remember.
Anyway, New Statesman it was to be. And the woman had picked out this name, and we were going to stick with it.
So basically, we had that idea. We then went and asked Michael Portillo, who was Laurence's MP, if he would show us around the House of Parliament, which he did very kindly and very thoroughly. And we became friends with him, even though it was a not strange relationship, unexpected relationship. And when the show went out, as a consummate politician, when we said to him, what did you think of it? He said, well, unfortunately, I set my VCR, but it didn't work. So he didn't have to have an opinion. And Renee Short, who was the Labour MP for Wolverhampton, or maybe the former Labour MP, I don't know if she's still sitting, she was our political advisor, and when we were doing scenes in the Houses of Parliament,
it was our SPAD.
She would have to tell the extras who were playing backbenchers that they weren't behaving badly enough in making enough noise.
She was great. I loved her.
So and that again, we were very lucky with the timing, and also the ITV then had this fantastic 10 o'clock slot, which we shared with Spitting Image and also metal, and there was a couple of London weekend shows. I'm sure people think that all these shows like Splitting Image must have been on the BBC, but they were all on ITV. The BBC has long been too lily-livered to have anything really political on television. Uh,
Absolutely.
um,
And I just wondered, you described that obviously Rick Mail came to you, and that was sort of like the genesis of the idea. How engaged was he in the writing process? Was he involved at all? Did he ever make any suggestions, or was he entirely happy to
Well,
leave it to you both?
he made suggestions. He wasn't involved in the writing process. Rick had lots of ideas, and they were usually far out ideas, which actually tested us. You know, Rick was really only removed from the young ones by being a little bit more grown up. But his ideas were, and he made us have radical ideas and far-fetched ideas. He would come around to our place to talk about ideas. You know, we'd say, we'd like to write an episode, for example, about, I don't know, about nuclear waste. And Rick would like that. That sounded really far out. And then he'd throw little ideas in. I'd really like to kind of ideas. Wouldn't it be great if I could? Because Rick was a very physical comedian. I mean, he was brilliant. Nothing Rick was in, whether it was his show or not, was going to miss Rick Mail. And I always say that there are very, very few actors who, when he's not doing anything on screen, your eyes are on him. He was charismatic.
So I think as far as the writing was concerned, yeah, we get together, you know, before a series, before we start writing, and have a couple of days knocking ideas around, and then when the scripts are written, he'd say, "Oh, you know, there's only 7 jokes on this page. Can I have 10 jokes?"
And I'll get you more.
And then or else we come to rehearsal and find that one line of stage direction has turned into a 5-minute torture scene, and then you have to say to him, "Well, you know, you're going to be 5 minutes over now."
Rick was only concerned in one thing, and that was getting an audience hysterical.
Yeah. So
laughter wasn't enough for Rick; it had to be hysterical.
So I guess
and so we only had 22 minutes.
Yeah. So there was no fat in the scripts, and because he'd come, you know, from a performance background and a sketch writing and performing background, I think the one thing he said which really hit home with me and informed the writing was to make every scene the funniest scene it could be. Whereas, you know, as dramatists, in inverted commas, you tend to structure a show, and some scenes don't have to be hysterical; they have to be informative, and they have to develop character. But as far as Rick was concerned, any scene in which he didn't, you know, hit someone or shag someone was a wasted opportunity.
And I ought to say that because of this pressure from Rick, we found it really, really difficult to write. Well, I don't mean because he was too much pressure on us, but by the end of the first series, we thought we'll close it down. We'll get an episode, we can close it down. That didn't really happen. But the second series, he said, we'll definitely close it down because we're going to have him murdered in the street outside the Department of Environment. He'll be shot dead. And how much Rick was involved in the show was that when it was suggested by director Jeff Sachs that we'll get a stand-in to be shot in the street, Rick, no way. I want to be.
So Rick was wired up to all the blood
bags and the explosion. So having then killed him, they said, "What are you going to do next with him?" And we said, "But he's dead." And they said, no. I mean, he's not really dead, is he? And we said, yeah, he was assassinated. They said, well, can you bring him back to life, please? And that led to the special, the one-off special when he comes back to life. And then at the end of that led to another series, at the end of which we thought, well, I know what we'll do. We'll have him in Siberia where he'll never get out again because there's a Berlin Wall and that's never going to come down. So we'll never see him again. And then the Berlin Wall comes. going to do
Yeah,
with him next.
we kept trying to. It was quite funny that. I mean, also we were very lucky with our work. Several projects on the go, so we weren't sort of dependent on a given show for our bread and butter. So therefore, we were a bit cavalier with it. I would disagree with Laurence's use of the word difficult, right? I never found it difficult, just found it exhausting. It was exhausting. Rick worked very hard, as an actor in rehearsal, he worked longer and harder than anyone that we'd ever worked with in a comedy setting. He was very dedicated to his mayhem. Um, but as for the politics, Rick wasn't political. He didn't really understand politics.
No, not at
I mean,
all. Surprised.
that's why, in the early 90s or the early noughties, he got not conned, but persuaded to make sort of anti-EU propaganda. Because he didn't really get it. Someone just said, "Oh no, the EU is like Nazi Germany." All right, is it? I'll make this video about and pretend to be Hitler. And he's oh, for God's sake, Rick.
He just trusted the script
But he
so
trusted it.
much.
He always just say we were the grown-ups in the room, and he said, "You understand politics. You're the grown-ups in the room, and I just want to make it funny." And it was,
It's a lovely combination.
and we were able to, obviously. I rather feel our impact on the Conservative government was sort of same. Reminds me of what Peter Cook said about the cabarets of Weimar Germany and what a good job they did in stopping the rise of Hitler. So I don't think, we were, a very small pea in a very strong wind.
But all I can say is that Rick said the object of our exercise is to be there after Thatcher's gone, and we were there after Thatcher's gone.
Yeah.
It had major to deal
when
with.
we were working in America on series 3, or was it series 3? Yeah. Around the time that Margaret Thatcher started to wobble, and we'd already written the first 2 episodes of the series. Then we had to go to America to work on a pilot of probably a Birds of a Feather, and so whilst we were out there, we were studying the papers, praying for Margaret Thatcher to hang on because we'd already written these scripts, and then we heard, oh no,
Rick kept ringing her. He kept, "You've got to get back. You've got to get back. Things are looking wobbly."
And then so she, as you know, there was a second vote. I think, oh God, what's going to happen?
We didn't know till we arrived back in London.
Did we know about the stairs?
No. What happened?
So we got back to London, and a taxi driver said,
"You heard the news," and then we said, "No, what is it?" He said, "She's gone. She's gone." And we drove us back to North London through streets that resembled VE night. We were just so happy she's gone. But of course, what we then had to do was rewrite these 2. It had to take on a different flavour, and we needed time. And now, whether he did this intentionally or not, and knowing Rick, it probably was fueled by alcohol, he fell down the stairs and dislocated his shoulder. And so
they postponed the filming.
Studio dates, and gave us time to write the.
Well, one of the best episodes we wrote was the episode we had to write, the first episode of that series.
Yes.
When Major is in, and Rick has been supplanted by a character called Victor Crosby.
Yeah, Victor Crosby. Most right-wing.
Far more right-wing than
Rick.
Which was a fabulous episode. And the actor, who I think sadly died.
Did he? Saxby or something.
He'd been in a great show called Brass with Timothy West. Anyway, doesn't matter. So yeah, Rick, it was a very good sacrifice of Rick.
Sadly, he did it again with his head years later. Never recovered.
So although it's seen as a political show, and of course it's a show about politics, and it enabled us to say various things that were fun to say, the most extreme things that we could imagine then happened. So not long after we wrote an episode in which Alan had hidden nuclear waste under a school in Grimsby, someone actually found nuclear waste under a school in Hull. So we weren't even more than 50 miles out.
But I think that what really cemented the series very, very early on was that an MP, Conservative MP,
Mhm.
had left his wife and moved his lover into the family home. And the Mirror found, oh, the press found out, and the Mirror ran a front page banner headline, "What a Bastard." And we knew that
And that
we,
was after about 3 weeks.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that came out, and we thought we've got it.
And interestingly, Gillian Reynolds, who was the radio reviewer of The Guardian, possibly at the time anyway, um, she was very snotty
Scathing.
about the New
Yes.
Statesman. And then about 2 years later, she apologized and said she realized that her children or her son had learned about politics and the workings of Parliament from watching the New Statesman.
Which, I mean, what better compliment can you get
Yeah.
than that? I,
Um,
I,
and
I just wondered, I was curious, how important do you think it was in the series that Bastard sort of unwitting henchman, his goon, Piers Fletcher Davis, played brilliantly by Michael Troughton, kind of represents in a way the sort of the almost the old idea of a Conservative MP, and Bastard represents very much the new
But of
Thatcherite
course,
idea.
of course, that was very much the case. But in fact, originally we had also Sir Stephen Baxter, who was the real old
Mhm.
grandee, who but by the end of the first series, we shed 3 or 4 characters because we realised we didn't have time in an ITV slot to do it. Oh, extremely, Piers represent, he was MP for Devizes, where, we vote for a lamppost that had a blue rosette. And um, he was well-meaning, yes, and very funny. The thing about Alan was he never wanted power. He wanted because power meant uh, responsibility and hard work. He just wanted the fun
Greed.
and the opportunity to make money. By the end,
Rather like Trump,
yes,
really.
yeah.
Yeah.
By the end, by the last series, he realized that he could have even more fun if he did become powerful. Unfortunately, that's the series I think that Boris Johnson watched. So, because it's clear where Johnson got all his moves from,
Yeah.
including the pelvic ones.
And after that series, you made the special A Bastard Exposed with Brian Walden, and I'm just curious, what was the conversation like with him? Was he up for it immediately to do that sort of interview
Who?
format
Walden.
with Brian Walden?
Walden contacted us.
Oh, really?
It wasn't the other way around. We
Yeah.
didn't say that. A contact was made with between London Weekend Television and our company Alamo. Walden had said something like he was leaving Walden and he wanted his last political interview to be with Alan Bastard.
Can I just say it did go out on BBC?
Yes.
Went out on BBC
Yes.
too.
But that was our choice, Alamo's choice.
Well, I don't know because
The fact Walden worked on ITV didn't matter. He just wanted to do an interview with
Yes.
Alan Bastard. We then said to Rick, "Will you do it?" And he said, "I can't possibly be in an interview. I mean, you'll have to write the whole thing, which included Walden's questions." And that's what we did.
And then it's a curiosity, really, not a completely successful one. But Walden, was happy to take our script and just rejig it in his style.
Yes.
And it gave us a chance to sort of investigate what Alan's politics would be if he really had any. But it was just a curiosity, and it was fun to do.
And then we brought him back onto the West End stage eventually, because we thought that there was too good an opportunity at the time that Blair had declared war or joined a war in Iraq, that in fact there were weapons of mass destruction, and they were given to Bastard to plant as an excuse to start a war, but nobody could find them. So we wondered what Bastard did, and that was the sort of genesis of what became whatever happened to Alan.
Which was great fun, and of course that enabled us to have the conceit that New Labour was completely the invention of Alan Bastard, which would have made a lot of sense.
And do you think that kind of like that ability of him as a character to sort of to almost move beyond the era in which he was created shows how much of an enduring character he is,
Yeah,
that
I
he could
think so.
exist in that New Labour era as well as
I'm sure that had Rick been alive, we would have been asked to write something when Johnson got in.
I think the thing is, it's not, on this occasion, and not for the only time, you cannot separate the character from the actor. And so it was an enduring creation as long as Rick played it. And for sure, yes, it was a powerful, he was a very charismatic actor. When we had the second tour of the play, he couldn't do the last 6 weeks because he was quite ill with, I think he had pneumonia. And the understudy for all his sterling efforts, couldn't sell tickets. We had to, they had to people to come to see Rick.
And I'd like to move on now, finally, to talk about Mosley, which is a series you wrote in 1998, and is obviously not a comedy series as such. It's a very sort of much more serious, dramatic work. I just wondered, what was it that prompted you to write that? What was it that made you think that you wanted to write a series about Oswald Mosley?
Well, there is a prelude to the story, which you will tell. We always felt there was a series to be written about a man who was almost ignored televisually for reasons that were obvious, of course. But we didn't want to write it. That was right, wasn't it?
Yeah, we grew up under the shadow of Mosley.
He was touched upon in Shine on Harvey Moon, of course.
When Mosley was trying to make a comeback in the 50s, we grew up in Finsbury Park, and his people used to quite often pitch their soapbox literally outside the house of some friends of ours at the other end of my street. My father and my sister, when she was sort of 10, were sort of chased down the street by black shirts. And it hadn't it had gone away, but it hadn't gone away. And so as Jews, as much as anything else, we felt that this history needed to be told before Cable Street, had been sort of annexed by the Corbynistas as a sort of a safe catch-all. I was at Cable Street. No, you weren't. So we had this idea, and now that we had a production company, we thought we should try to produce it, make it happen. But we didn't feel that we were the people to write it. We felt we were perceived as comedy writers, and this was a very serious project. So we invited to lunch one of the leading right-wing political dramatists, whose name Laurence will supply.
Ian Curtis.
Thank you. Was it Curtis or Curtis? Who had written the Falkland play, so on and so forth, which had been spiked, I think.
But he'd written much else.
But that was but his spiking was something that was really pretty current, or relatively current anyway. We took him out for lunch. I can quite much remember where, but it was wood panelled and very expensive. We thought that's what he would like, and we said, "Are you interested?" And he said, "They won't buy it if I write it." It was very pleasant and very forthright. They won't buy it if I write it. You should write it. He didn't quite say it as boldly as this, but if you should write it, you're Jewish, they wouldn't be able to turn it down. And so,
but that was years before the chairman of Andre Deutsch, a man called Tom Rosenthal, we become friendly with him because he published a new Statesman script. And we mentioned Mosley and one thing and another. And he said, if ever you do want to do it, let me know, because one of my authors is Nicholas Mosley, Mosley's son. Eventually, years later, all years were passing between this, we said to Tom, we'd like to meet Nicholas if you could organise it. And he did. And we met him in Soho. We didn't know what to expect at all, other than this man was a seriously top-notch author, a man who had won the Whitbread Prize for his biographies of his father. And Nick was a man, I reckon, then in his 80s perhaps, who came into the restaurant on a walking stick and had a terrible stammer. And Tom came too. And Tom said, these are the chaps that would like to write about your father. And it was a long lunch and a very pleasant one, although both Maurice and I agreed that our parents would be turning in their graves if they thought we were sitting having lunch with Mosley's son. Nonetheless, what Nicholas said to us was, I would like you to write the first, we thought it would be 4 films. Write the first of the 4 films, and if I like what you've done and I feel it represents my father fairly, I will open up the Mosley archive to you, and that's what happened.
Well, I think I can't remember all the details. I know that we obviously read the 2 volumes. I can't remember if we read the 2 volumes before we started writing.
Of course.
And I can't remember if we started writing before we had sold the idea in principle.
What happened was, it was decided by our company that the BBC wouldn't buy this. I think Alan had said this, Alan McEwen. And we went to Channel 4 because Michael Grade was the controller of Channel 4. We were friendly with Michael and we thought we'd have an in. And what's more, the head of drama, a man called, can't remember, Peter Ansorge, was Jewish. And we thought we were, so we went along to see him and said we'd like to do 4 films as a serial on Oswald Mosley, and he said, I love it. Michael said, let's do it.
Well, those were the days, I know those are the days, is if I had the energy to write a biography, or I'd probably call those were the days. We went to see Peter Ansorge, we pitched him the idea, we probably told him that we had access to the source material. So Peter Ansorge more or less commissioned it in the room, 4 hours, and then Channel 4 in Horseferry Road, where they used to be, I think, off Victoria Street anyway, was a building full of glass corridors and glass boxes in offices. So Michael Grade, although he was the chief executive of Channel 4, we could see him through a series of glass walls. And we came out of Peter Ansorge's office, and obviously Michael knew why we were going to see Peter Ansorge, and he beckoned us. So he probably already knew it was going to be yes, because Michael loves being the harbinger of good news. He called into the office and he said, I hear you're doing something for us now. I don't think he must have, he kind of heard, I don't think he heard it, because Peter phoned him whilst we were trekking down the corridor. So that was a remarkable experience. Nicholas Mosley was a charming man. We met him, and we also met his sons, who were, I think, were both writers, or certainly in the arts, one of whom was most concerned that we didn't whitewash his grandfather. And then there
were so many stories about Mosley.
And then we had the job of trying to contain it and tell the story and understand.
We did follow the books, very much so.
Understand the man, which meant really that most of the what you might call the nasty stuff happens in the last episode and a third, say,
well, from the time we met Diana.
Yes, so some people criticized it because we didn't just write a 4-hour diatribe about this terrible, terrible person. Tried to understand his journey to becoming a fairly terrible person.
The most exciting for me part of the whole process was once Nicholas had approved it and showed it to his sister, whose name I can't remember, her sister actually was locked in the 30s. She although we met her in the 90s, this woman belonged in the 30s. And we were invited to Nicholas's home with Verity, his wife, to meet the sister. And then they both agreed that the first film was really excellent and portrayed their father as he should be portrayed. And then said, after supper, we'd like you to see my father's films. His father was a keen 8mm movie maker, and we really got a history of pre-war England that evening. Films of Ramsay MacDonald coming to visit Lloyd George coming to visit. It was just the most magnificent evening, if you're in the least bit a historian. And all this, and then there were documents and letters. And so Nicholas was always on hand when we said, would your father have? Nicholas, who was, as I say, the most accomplished writer, said, yes, I think he would have done that. And Nicholas was just marvellous. And he wrote us a series of very, very complimentary letters, which we value to this day.
Of course, because it's as historically as accurate as possible. One of the things we had to attempt to show was that the Battle of Cable Street didn't really ever take place, which disappoints all the people who were there.
I recently watched Outrageous, which was completely inaccurate, but who cares? And that made, who cares?
What's Outrageous?
It was about Mosley and the Mitford sisters.
Yes.
And, everything about it was wrong, but it didn't matter. We had people, I live in a big house, there are people in the house that said, wasn't it marvellous? It so captured the time. I said, yeah, but it was totally inaccurate. Oh, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me.
An interesting sideline, which, well, I'll tell you, you can decide whether it's interesting or not, is that when we were doing Making Goodnight Sweetheart, in one episode, we wanted someone to play Robert Maxwell. I don't know if you're familiar with Goodnight Sweetheart or not, but Robert Maxwell as a dodgy young officer comes into the pub, and he was played by Jonathan Cake, and who had like one or two really good strong scenes as this
Robert Maxwell,
supercilious chap with a very, very slight Czech accent, who claims to be an English gentleman, and we knew, and that was probably about 95, 96. We both said to each other, so to speak, he's our Mosley. Now today, and we did actually cast him, although we saw two or three other people. We were asked to see other people with much more famous and less silly names. Now I don't know whether today you could say we want to do a 4-part series, and they would say, well, you're going to get Brad Pitt, aren't you? And you say, well, no, we thought we'd get Jonathan Cake. No, you've got to get Brad Pitt.
No one really interrupted us in casting terms. Otherwise, we'd never have had Pauline and Linda as Sharon and Tracy. And it's interesting we should be talking about this, because tonight I have a film show here, because we have someone in the house who's an academic philosopher who's really, really keen to see the 4 films. So I'll watch it again. But I enjoyed watching it. I thought it was a very well-made film.
Not series, really.
Well, you call it a series, I call it a film.
I call it a series because when
it's not a movie, it's a film.
Because when for foreign sales, it was cut together into a single 2-hour movie without our involvement, nothing to do with us, cut together by the sales company. It is such an abomination.
Was what it was.
Yeah, but it's very hard to cut a 4-hour.
I enjoyed it. Nicholas enjoyed it enormously, and that pleased me.
But from the point of view
of Rosenthal, of course,
I don't know. Yes, how impactful it was, I can't remember.
Very much so. Adversely, people wanted us on their programs to discuss why we were so kind to this man, that he had a soft side. Well, our new play, which opens next month, is about Hitler, and someone whose father was in the Black Shirts, funnily enough, that's an aside, wrote to me and said, Laurence, I've just read your play. He said, and what really upset me was that you made me feel sympathetic towards Hitler. And that's rather what it was with Mosley, because everyone was expecting a ranting lunatic who wanted to get Jews out of England. In fact, as Maurice says, for the first 2 hours of the film, he was a very reasonable and good politician. He changed sides. He crossed the house, but then so did Churchill. That shouldn't be held against him. It was once he realised he couldn't get leadership of a major party that he would start his own.
Yeah, the opportunistic
Yeah.
side of him
But
really came
but
through.
you see, we're seeing it now to a certain extent, not to the same extent, but the same way that Mosley, as a man, if not a man of the left, certainly a member of the Labour Party, and a man whose solutions to the Great Depression were relatively progressive, very progressive for their day, but to cling to power, or not to cling to power, to get a taste of power, was prepared to go with the prevailing mood of the day, which was fascism and of course anti-Semitism. In fact, the British Union of Fascists was not going to be anti-Semitic initially until he realized he could get more support from Germany than he could from Italy. I don't want to make an unfair comparison, but the sirens call of racism seems to be heard even in 10 Downing Street. It's just too easy to give in to those facile solutions, and we're seeing it now from left and from right.
Yes, no, absolutely. We're coming towards the end of the podcast. Thank you, Laurence and Maurice, for taking the time to speak to me. But I do have one sort of final question. You've got the play coming out, the new play, and the new Goodnight, Sweetheart novel. Hopefully, will be available very soon. What can you sort of like give us maybe a hint as to what people who will see the play and read the book can expect from it and look forward to enjoying with both?
Very kindly to ask.
I can't imagine what people will expect from the Hitler Freud play.
So,
I think
well,
they will be curious how we've depicted Hitler, and they'll be curious as to how we've depicted Freud.
the play is called Dr. Freud Will See You Now, Mrs. Hitler, based on the question, what would have happened if Hitler's mother had taken her distraught and frankly odd child to visit the great Dr. Freud in Vienna's first clinic for children with nervous disorders. Would the world be any different? It's sort of the ultimate what if. As far as the book, Laurence, you can say a few words about the book.
Well, it will comprise the series that wasn't. In 2016, we did a special. Everyone expected it to be the beginning of the new series. It wasn't, for all sorts of political reasons that had nothing to do with us. And so what we would do now is work out just what those 6 episodes would have been and then novelize them.
The revelation that we stumbled on when we wrote that special in 2016, which is why it was a shame we didn't get to go further with it, was that whereas Goodnight Sweetheart was originally the story of a man of today stuck in the past, the story of the new Goodnight Sweetheart is a man of the past stuck in the future, because the things that have happened since Gary Sparrow was last here are extraordinary. Even though the book is set not today but in 2016 for reasons just of the relative age of the characters. And again, it's somewhat political. He'll arrive back in the UK during the referendum campaign, for example. But for the fans of the show who are not first and foremost political geeks, which I think might be the majority, the other great thing that was happening around the time of the series that wasn't was that the Beatles were about to come on the scene, and he'd spent the last 20 years putting their work off as his own.
Yeah.
So that's very much some pigeons.
We've got to change history.
So really,
Yeah.
The first thing he has to do in the book is meet Brian Epstein and persuade him not to take the band on. So really, once you start thinking about the ramifications, they are of tremendous fun. He might also meet Harold Wilson and suggest that he adopts a pipe because it's a good idea. You can have
can do what you like with that because it's fiction and you're playing with time. And in many ways, all this conversation, this podcast, has been about playing with time. We weren't there in Harvey Moon's era. We had to imagine it. we weren't there in Mosley salad days, so we have to imagine it. And we weren't sitting in the House of Commons during Bastard's time there, so we had to imagine it. And all are works of imagination.
And all wonderful works of imagination as well. Thank you both for taking the time to speak to me, and I hope that everyone listening, goes out and if they haven't already watched the new Statesman and Harvey Moon and Mosley and aren't, haven't got the book yet or planning to get the the Goodnight Sweetheart book, that they do
Book will be
and
out
go
next
to see.
spring, so tell them not to queue yet.
And if they really want to go and see Miss Dr. Freud will see you now, Mrs. Hitler. It's at the upstairs at the Gatehouse at Highgate, the home of psychotherapy.
A fantastic place for it to be. Well, thank you once again, both of you, for taking
You're
the
very
time.
welcome. Nice to meet you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.